want to tell you why. I want to give you 3 reasons, at least 3 reasons, why I think we should give aid to countries that have corrupt governments. My first reason is a very simple one. All of them are fairly simple. The poor suffer. The poor in countries led by corrupt officials already suffer as a result of having those corrupt governments. I don't see donors sort of actually adding to their plight. So just for that one reason, I would argue that these poor actually deserve assistance. They are victims of their own governments. Let us not blame them as victims. They don't choose to have corrupt governments. Thus, donors, I don't think, should actually add to their predicament by starving them of aid or assistance. But also remember, the role of governments are that of intermediation. They intermediate aid from you, from the donors, to their poor. And if they fail in intermediating aid from you to the poor, and think of the poor as being the citizens of the planet, first and foremost, I mean, ahead of being citizens of their sovereign nations. Because remember, sovereignty is basically lines drawn on the planet. But to begin with, the poor are the citizens of the planet. And if their governments are failing in providing them, in channeling the aid to their poor from you, then I think there is a responsibility for all of us to actually try and reach the poor through alternative channels. And there are alternative channels. I think some of these are already being tried. So the answer to the question on whether we should give aid to countries whose governments are corrupt is a yes. But the bigger question is, how do you get to the poor? How do you reach them? And very quickly, I keep saying if these governments don't deliver, bugger them. Sort of get around them and get to the poor more directly. And I think that can be done. So the challenge is, how do you reach the poor in countries that have corrupt governments? I would say the challenge for donors is in devising mechanisms to deliver aid to the poor, taking into account that most of these countries where they will be operating will have corrupt governments. So let us not say this is an exception. The issue is that most of the recipient governments will be corrupt by one measure or the other. In fact, by TI's measure, of the 178 countries that they collect data on perceptions of corruption, 3/4 of them, 3/4 of these countries fail in terms of their ranking between 0 and 10, they get a ranking below 5. And the majority of them who fail are the countries that are recipients of aid. So how do you get to the poor in these countries? Well, the quick answer would be to go via international non-government organizations, alluded to earlier on. World Vision, I think, has been a favorite of mine, but there's Red Cross, there's MSF, there's quite a few others. Yeah, all of them, okay, yeah, sure. The other is to go through local non-government organizations. One of my favorites, and I happen to be from Fiji, as you know, is the Women's Crisis Center, which has been doing some marvelous work. It just so happens that the lady who's running it happens to be a good friend of mine. So I'm suggesting you don't believe everything I say about her, but I think she has been quite effective. But then thirdly, and this is probably more subtle than the first two, I said NGOs, local and international. The third is this. We may label a government as being corrupt. Choose your most corrupt government. But I think it's too broad a brush to taint an entire government as being corrupt. If you look very closely at governments which are tainted as being corrupt, you always find some bits of government which are pretty clean.